All right. So we have a special treat for our next section. Lorraine, is Lorraine in here? This one's for you. It's about government. So our next session is going to be moderated by Z Prime's research analyst, Hiba Bukhari. So please help me in welcoming Hiba to the stage today.
Thank you, Ricky. That was an amazing panel. Please help me welcome Dr. Carolyn Kissane and Melissa Miyashiro. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Well, that was quite a panel. So I just want to say that was like quite fantastic. It was really such a pleasure to hear from those phenomenal CEOs.
It was, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. So I want to start with you, Carolyn. There's an urgency to reach decarbonization goals, to close the energy gap, and tackle the water crisis and water insecurity that has pushed governments for more intervention in both the water and energy sectors. How exactly has the relationship between the water and energy sectors with governments shifted over the years?
So thank you. Yeah, I know it's a great question. I'm probably going to put, my answer is going to more focus on the energy side because that's more in line with what I research and teach at NYU. I mean, there's been a lot of government intervention in the last few years, and especially I would say 2021 and the start of 2022, although we're 3 quarters into it. Here, closer to home in the United States, over the summer, there was great fanfare over the Inflation Reduction Act, which very significant climate legislation, $376 billion, and very much sort of couched under energy security with a lot of support for renewable energy, a lot of, tax incentives and the such. And then many of you maybe did read it, or maybe after today you will read it, but the National Security Strategy of 2022 very, very explicitly made a case for the United States to really position itself with regards to climate change and decarbonization. So climate change was mentioned 63 times in the National Security Strategy, very specifically sort of also targeting China to outcompete China. We also saw in the spring of 2022, the United States used the Defense Production Act for critical minerals. I mean, this is very, I think, explicit that the United States recognizes the importance of, addressing climate change both through mitigation and adaptation, but also sort of recognizing where the vulnerabilities and the risks are across the supply chain. And then I think, closer to home where I live in New York City, you have Local Law 97, which is, issued by New York State, but requires all buildings that are 25,000 square feet or more that they have to implement very, very strict, specific energy efficiency measures, retrofits, that goes all into effect in 2024. And just interestingly enough, today, or at least I read about it today, that in France, Emmanuel Macron just passed legislation that all car parks that are 40 or more vehicles will be required to install solar panels. So this is to go into effect in the next 5 years. So it's an example, but there are multiple examples, I think, across Europe. The EU taxonomy went into effect last January, specifically sort of targeting adaptation and mitigation. So I think we're seeing a lot of government intervention. I could give you many more examples.
Thank you. Melissa, do you want to add to that, especially like with the other side of things, which is the water sector and the relationship between the governments and the water sector?
Yeah, I'm also spend most of my time in the energy space, but we'll definitely echo, and this is a lot of the work that we do at Blue Planet Foundation. Just for some introduction and background, I'm from a small nonprofit. We're a team of 7 based in Honolulu, Hawaii, and most of our work is focused on shaping policy and really guiding state and local decision making and really setting up the policy framework and doing the the research and kind of data crunching that's behind that, and then connecting that with the community conversation and community outreach. So yeah, this is a really exciting time to be talking about the role of government and kind of guiding and setting up the framework and how the different organizations like nonprofits or businesses, how we're all connected and moving forward on this together. So I'm excited to talk more about that over the course of this panel.
Yeah, so this connectedness between those sectors and the government has been a culmination of years and decades of grassroots work. Can you tell us more about the role of individual communities, nonprofit organizations, and small organizations in driving the cleaner cleaner energy and decarbonization efforts?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we've seen this come up in a number of examples in Hawaii specifically, but I really see our role as a nonprofit and the communities that we're and individuals that we're communicating with, we're really partners for government and for business. So in our focus on kind of grassroots activation, an example of that probably many are familiar with is Hawaii's 100% renewable energy law. Blue Planet was really the group that led the grassroots advocacy effort and stakeholder and business engagement on that measure. It took multiple years to actually pass that legislation. We started advocating for that in 2013. And then over time, it kind of started out as more a kind of direct advocacy measure. And then over a course of a number of years, we really activated this grassroots conversation about 100% renewable. And it was really, as we've seen, it's a good complement to the work that government is doing. And if there's government ambition, to set a goal, nonprofits and community-based organizations can be objective messengers coming in and advocating and just adding a different perspective. And that's worked really well on kind of the setting big policy goals, but also on the kind of smaller policy framework, things that the Public Utilities Commission and regulation there, also things like appliance efficiency standards. So, thinking about something like appliance efficiency standards, everyday residents aren't thinking about that, but nonprofits, community-based organizations can be the ones that's kind of connecting the dots from the government or wonky policy conversation and translating that to what that means for everyday residents.
So Carolyn, and we talked a lot about the role of civil society and nonprofit organizations in nudging the governments to take actions, which their efforts have been immense. Where do you see the global leadership in sustainability really coming from?
The global leadership in the sort of the civil society space, where
on sustainability, like leading sustainability efforts, where do you think it's coming from? Is it from the top down, bottom up? How is it?
I would say it's a mix. I mean, everyone in this room has spoken over the last 2 days about their commitments to sustainability in terms of what they're doing, addressing how within their own companies and organizations they're approaching decarbonization. So I do think, the private sector plays a extraordinarily critical role. I think it's coming from governments, it's coming from civil society. We saw, we're having this conference in the middle of the Conference of Parties number 27, which is happening right now in Egypt. And if you go back to the first couple of conferences, there wasn't a very big place for civil society. And now civil society plays a much more, I think, distinctive role. So I would say it's and also I'm at New York University. I see young people who are making demands. Wonderful speaker earlier from Stanford University, but I mean, my students only want to go work for companies that are working in the renewable energy space. They are not interested in working in the fossil fuel space. They are really they want to work for purpose-driven companies, like companies that they feel really have a strong purpose. So I think, even amongst universities now, universities have a whole sustainability ranking system. So when you're applying to university, you can see where a university falls only to emphasize that, I do think it's not distinctly in one sector. I would say it's both, in terms of coming from civil society, it's coming from the private sector, it's coming from governments. Again, going back to COP27, in 2015, you had over 100, probably almost 100 countries commit to some kind of net zero, net neutrality goals, which we could argue as to, what are some of the challenges there. But nonetheless, I do think that, governments are coming out with targets. There are new regulations that are in place that are sort of driving that change.
Melissa, do you want to add to what Carolyn said?
I'll just comment that I think part of what we see is sometimes there's a disconnect between the conversation that's happening at the community level and how people are feeling about things individually in households and schools, and the conversation that's happening, on like global stages like COP27. And I think it just underscores the need for connecting the dots on those two conversations more. And I think that's happening, but we still have a long way to go to bridge the gap between government and rolling those things out at the community level.
For sure. Carolyn, you mentioned the private sector specifically, and this is something that we touched on during our conversation last week. With the very tense international affairs and foreign policies across the globe, actually, it's happening. How can we get governments and businesses to work together to fight climate change and to reach those decarbonization goals?
So again, I do think it's already happening, and I think that governments that are sort of setting standards, for example, and expecting corporations to follow, they also have to sort of make sure that the regulatory environment is such that it's conducive for companies to work. I think here in the United States, I know that earlier talking about the grid in terms of the permitting process can be very complex. So I think there are lots of ways that the government can kind of ease some of the hurdles that companies have to go through to get projects out and working. And I think, you have a lot of companies that, you do have some companies that are guilty of greenwashing, but many companies that are very deeply committed to achieving greater sustainability, to sort of looking at their sort of climate footprint. You also have, of course, kind of more of the stick approach in terms of new, from the SEC, for example, carbon disclosure and the like, that the expectation is that companies will be working to sort of address carbon emissions across their supply chain. In Europe, you have a carbon border adjustment that is under sort of a discussion to go into play. There's been discussion here in the United States to use something like that. I think also something that's interesting that just happened in Canada around a lithium company is the divestment of three Chinese banks. So kind of going back to that more interventionist role in terms of, the government sort of using its power to say, like, who can play, who can invest, the fact that we're kind of creating a kind of maybe an easier system for mining in the United States. I mean, the United States used to mine. We haven't been a kind of a mining country for a long time. But how do you bring the mining and the processing? Because we have tremendous dependencies on China right now for a lot of the critical minerals and metals that are required for the energy transition.
Okay, so from a financial perspective, recently there has been a lot of policies that are adapting, like you said, the sticks approach, but also there's the carrots approach, meaning on the one hand, governments are offering incentives and subsidies. On the other hand, they're imposing taxes and fines. on businesses and as well as individuals for implementing a cleaner and water and energy future. How effective have these policies been, and what more can governments do when it comes to financial policies concerning decarbonization goals?
Start. Yeah, I can share my experience of how this has worked in Hawaii, and it's a conversation as an organization that thinks about policy design and thinks about removing barriers to achieving the goals that we want on decarbonization. We think a lot about this balance between carrots and sticks, and I think there is room and need for both. And it really depends on kind of the issue and the goal that you have on a particular issue. So an example of a stick is like our 100% renewable energy mandate. So it's actually not just a goal in Hawaii, it's a part of our renewable portfolio standard, and the utility could face financial penalties if they don't achieve that. And we've also been having a conversation in wanting to get to 100% renewable energy grid. It became clear that our electric utilities didn't have the right financial incentives in order to pave the way towards that quickly. So we embarked on a pretty comprehensive performance-based regulation conversation, and that's ongoing, and we're learning lessons from that. We also have state-level programs around rebates for electric vehicle charging. So in Hawaii, we've been making pretty great progress on renewable electricity, but we have a long way to go on decarbonizing the transportation sector. Our public charging network is woefully inadequate. So we've been thinking from a policy design standpoint, how do we really accelerate the expansion of public charging systems, and we chose a carrot approach, and that seems to be getting momentum now. So I think there's room for both, there's need for both, and it really is not just kind of formula for things, but really looking at the specific goals, what are the barriers, and then designing the policy around that specifically.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, maybe I can sort of touch a little bit about water. This summer was very interesting around the world, right, due to a number of significant water security situations. But here in California, Colorado, you had the Colorado River, right? And you had this moment where there was going to be very direct federal government intervention in an area that the federal government has generally been kind of hands off on, right? You got the 7 states, around that basin. So that would have been kind of more of a stick approach, like those that use the water, right, are going to have to better manage it, because otherwise the federal government is going to step in. So I think there's, we're sort of, see a lot of both the carrots and the sticks in place. I think, depending on, like just in this room, you have different states, you have different that are represented, you have different countries that are represented that are using sort of different policies and approaches to sort of move the needle. It is going to be very challenging, but I do think that it's a kind of a combination type of toolkit that's being used today.
Do you think there's more that could be done in terms of those like financial incentives and penalties?
Well, I think everyone I think everyone would agree that there probably more can be done, and we're looking for more to be done. I've been very impressed over, what I've heard over the last 2 days in terms of what everyone here is doing to do it at their, from where they are, and to expand. And I think we'll be seeing more, not less, get done. And I do think that even in the United States, where if you had said climate change, 10 years ago, there were still, I think, a fair number of people here in the U.S., I'll just speak to the U.S., who maybe were like, yeah, maybe climate change is happening. But now it's, based on the most recent data out of, the Pew polling, it's 70% of the United States really do believe and see climate change, and they're recognizing the impacts that it's having. It's not that climate change is happening somewhere else. It's happening right where they live, and they're experiencing it, they're seeing it, they recognize that that change is required. So I think there's much more of public support for the efforts and actions that need to take place.
Okay. So before I move on with the rest of my questions, I want to open the floor for our audience to ask questions to our speakers. Is there any?
If I were teaching, I'd start calling on people, but I'm not in the classroom, so I won't call on you. What?
I'd like to see that.
You go ahead. You're the moderator. You can.
Oh, there's a question there, please.
I was just advised not to ask a long question. So, there's a lot of countries which are stating that they, cannot really aggressively pursue climate change, or they're saying they will, but they're not, because they need to transition, up the development path, right? They say that carbon and coal are necessary for them to transition. So, and it's too expensive to transition if they don't take that low-cost coal-based path. So what is your advice from both of you? What is your advice for those kind of governments? We state that they need a low-cost, coal-based, carbon-based path to move up the development ladder.
So are you talking about here or?
International. Here we are already past that stage. We are already, ramping down coal, but India, China, right?
No, I think it's a really tough challenge, and we've seen. I mean, I think when you look at 2022 numbers, you're going to see an increase in coal over 2021 and 20. Right, 2020 was interesting because of COVID, and but the expectation, and we've already seen it, is that coal demand and coal consumption is up for 2022. China's continues to build new coal power plants. I think India is very interesting because I think India is actually making a much more concerted effort to sort of think about how they don't take the same pathway that China took in terms of its own economic growth, and much of that was, of course, driven by access to sort of cheap domestic coal. Something that's being discussed in Egypt right now is, how does the developed world help to sort of finance the energy transition, the just energy transition? And how do we say to countries that, might choose coal because it's there, it might be, proximity-wise, to say, no, don't do that, do something else. So it's actually being kind of experimented with South Africa. So, what came out of Glasgow was a fund, a transition fund for South Africa. South Africa is also heavily dependent on coal. So how do you reduce that coal and bring in more renewable energy? What type of climate finance is required? But it's difficult. I mean, even China this past summer that was experiencing, record heat wave. They were seeing, rivers and dams start to really, in terms of, reductions in water, you still saw them turning to coal for air conditioning, for cooling. So it seems like a contradiction, right? That, firsthand climate change and then turning to coal. But part of it will be financing, part of it will be getting the investments in, I think that's also important.
Yeah, and I'll just add, this underscores this question about not thinking about one-size-fits-all solutions, and thinking about, and that's why I get so fired up and believe so much in the power of local action, because it really is, the solutions and approaches are really depend on where you're looking. This comes up a lot specifically for Hawaii with respect to other island nations across the Pacific. So we have a lot of conversations with other islands in the Pacific, wanting to learn from Hawaii, what we're doing from a policy standpoint, from an implementation standpoint. And a lot of times what those island communities need isn't necessarily a policy framework or a policy mandate, but it's financing. So thinking about, not necessarily just kind of transporting the formula for decarbonization, but listening deeply and understanding local communities, their needs, their different, the different technology, what their electrical grid looks like, what their, just what the local community needs, and not just kind of replicating things that work in one jurisdiction but might not work in another jurisdiction.
Thank you.
I just had a question with regards to the energy transition and some of the things I've seen here in California as far as utility white papers to get to net zero by 2045. I've seen things up to like a 4x capacity increase requirement, right? And so the cost question comes into play here. So in reading those, I'm seeing kind of a wish list and things that we can anticipate seeing in rate cases. And if that all goes into rate base, I think we're going to have a very serious affordability issue, right? And so, my question is, how are we looking at this from like a government perspective as far as an investment? Like, the transcontinental railway, the national highway system, are we taking that kind of approach? Like, hey, we need to do this for our future, and are we setting it up properly? Because again, if it goes into rate base, we're going to have a real affordability issue. So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll just say that's exactly why we embarked on the conversation in Hawaii about performance-based regulation and figuring out, what does this look like? Affordability is a gigantic problem in Hawaii. Our electricity rates are 3 times the national average. We just had the last coal plant in the state closed down a couple months ago, and because we're still so heavily reliant on imported oil for electricity, residents saw a spike in their electricity bills. So it's an active conversation. The Public Utilities Commission is thinking about that constantly. And then from our perspective as a nonprofit, then we as a kind of community-facing group, we're getting calls and emails from residents in Hawaii say, I just read about this order from the Public Utilities Commission. They're going to be doing time of use rates. What does that mean for me? So it's both kind of setting up that framework, but then you also need that kind of that translation or that conduit to communicate to residents what this means for them, so that they're part of the conversation and they're part of this building this political and public will for greater funding for the transition.
So I can't speak directly to California, but it's interesting when I teach geopolitics of energy. That's one of my big classes. And when you look at, for example, Europe, which has been in the middle of a very large energy crisis due to the Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine, you've had in terms of thinking about government interventions, you had the potential for a threat in terms of consumers saying that they were not going to pay their electricity bills in the UK, right? You've had protests in France because of, higher electricity bills, higher petrol, everything. So I do think that's that has to be kind of top of mind as we think about the energy transition. For Europe, it's like they're being kind of forced to expedite a transition that they had not necessarily planned for. But yeah, no, I think it's a big issue, and I think you're also seeing this a kind of a stepping back and saying, okay, maybe here in California, even the rethinking of keeping Diablo Canyon open, right? There's been 360s, like Japan was all set to close, to really move away from nuclear. Now they're completely coming back to nuclear after 90% of the reactors were shut down after Fukushima. You see Scandinavia, you see Sweden making that decision to build new nuclear. So I think that sense of, thinking about energy security in the midst of a very deep energy transition is really important. And then thinking about, how do you get your sources to be closer to home so you're not dependent on sort of imports that may not be reliable. So again, Europe has been kind of a big case study for that issue of, where were the dependencies for gas very much on, piped gas from Russia. And when, you're not getting that, then you're going to have to sort of think about what the alternatives are and what does it mean for the consumer. So you've had I mean, France alone has just spent $49 billion to cushion consumers and industry. So, that's governments can't afford to keep doing that. So I think there's lots of thought about how do you manage the transition that we're in or the energy evolution that we're in, and making sure that it doesn't fall on to the consumers and to those that are most vulnerable.
Lauren, you had a question?
Is it on? Okay. I just wanted to make one comment in response to your question, and I think it's really important, the role of the regulator. Unfortunately, we don't have a regulator up there, but that's okay. Melissa did a yeoman's job of talking about performance-based regulation, which I think is a real paradigm shift. This is an innovation conference, so that should not be underscored. I know Melissa doesn't want to brag too much about Hawaii, but the EU and Canada already do a form of performance-based regulation, Rio. That is a paradigm shift because that incentivizes the right things. And we talked about market signals, we talked about dynamic pricing, we talked about, how do we get the change implemented? And it is the role of the regulator. I know throughout the 2 days, people have said, what's the role of the regulator? Kind of blame the regulator for being too slow, which is true in terms of adoption of technology that can really help drive cost savings. But it is changing the paradigm that instead of utilities looking at cost recovery, everything has to go back in rate base. It's really looking at it more from a competitive market model, where utilities under performance-based regulation get rewarded for saving money and then and meeting specific performance measures, among which are hitting the renewables, affordability, modernizing the grid, doing certain things that they've identified they need to do in order to get to 100% renewable and 100% decarbonization. But in exchange for that, they get the flexibility of not having to come back to the commission for an approval for a 3-cent rebate back to the customer. You can instead flexibly deploy that money into something else which was a priority that was identified, whether it's grid modernization, smart grid technology, smart metering, helping large customers like water utilities become more part of demand side management. You have that ability, as you would in the private sector in an unregulated situation, to deploy that money where it's needed on a priority basis. So that's a real different paradigm shift. And if that is successful, and right now they're in the process, so you should go to that docket in the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission to see it. The utility is proposing performance, measures, performance indicators, with, of course, stakeholder input, a lot of technical working groups, a lot of stakeholders, solar industries at the table, renewable industries at the table, consumer advocates are at the table, NGOs are at the table. So I think that is a real difference, and that is government in action, and it's not something the US has done. There's some states that are looking at it. EU has done it, Canada has done it, some of the models that are there, the Rio model. So hopefully, that's an area where we can make a sea change again. And I would, kind of like Andrew did in answer to a question, I don't think coal's cheaper. When you look at the cost, you look at the cost benefits, you look at the health impacts, it's not cheaper. So renewables are cheaper if you weigh all the cost benefits, solar and wind. I mean, you look at some of the pricing in the Texas markets. You look at ERCOT, negative pricing on certain days. I mean, you can't get cheaper than that. So, that's the paradigm shift as well, that it's worth the investment. So again, that takes integrated action, as what the wonderful thought leaders on the panel today have said. It's integration at the local level, state level, and with enough federal support, infrastructure support now. You don't necessarily want the federal government dictating everything per community, but if the support is there, then that's the best combination. So this is a wonderful opportunity for innovators like you around the table to input into that process.
Well said. Thank you. That was
Thank
perfect.
you so much, Lorraine. And thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Melissa. Very much a pleasure having you joining me here. Please,
Thank you.
everyone, give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.